Tina is a foreign policy advisor on human rights and religious freedom for US Congressman Trent Franks. She coordinates and staffs the Congressman's bipartisan International Religious Freedom Caucus, where she organizes hearings, writes legislation, and influences US foreign policy decisions. Prior to working for the Congressman, Tina was a researcher at the US Commission on International Religious Freedom and a teacher prior to that. She obtained her Master's in Human Rights from the University of Essex here in the UK and her Master's in Education from Vanguard University in California. She has focused on human rights education in her prior activities. Tina and I actually met originally at the UN in Geneva, the Human Rights Council, while we were both advocating against the resolutions combating defamation of religion. Tina Ramirez.
Thank you. Do I need to speak into this? Does anybody know? Should I use the microphone? Do I need to?
Yeah, that would be nice.
Okay. So now everybody can hear me.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank Babu and Roy, first of all, for allowing me to come and speak to everyone. And it's an honor for me. I know that there's probably a lot more experts here on the Dalits and untouchables than I am, so I am not going to claim to be an expert on that issue. But what I do know, I do want to share with you, and that's on how the United States government is addressing the problem of untouchability. That's something I've been working on for a few years now, and hope that it can be of some encouragement and use to you, and maybe we can talk after I'm done sharing a little bit with you about some ideas you might have for me as well. As Roy mentioned, I work for the Congressman, and when I started working for him about 2.5 years ago, he had introduced a resolution on untouchability, and the resolution was in the 109th Congress, which was about 4 or 5 years ago, but it didn't go anywhere. It got stuck in committee and didn't even get passed out of committee because it was very broad and it had too much language in it. So when I came on board, one of his top priorities for me was to look at the Dalit Untouchability Resolution and to look at how we get it passed through the US Congress. And the purpose of that was that he had traveled to India in, I think, 2004 or 2005. And when he traveled there, he went to Karnataka and he went to Gujarat and he went to, I think, Dalit and a number of other places. And he was just very moved by what he saw and just the immensity of the suffering by untouchables and other people in India. And he just has a really strong heart for wanting to stand up for justice and human dignity, and I do as well, and that's why he has me work for him. And so when I came on board, I was tasked with working on that resolution and trying to get it passed in Congress. So this is HCON Res 139, if anybody's interested. And HCON Res 139 was a concurrent resolution with the Senate so that hopefully, if it was passed, it would be a statement by the whole United States government of what U.S. policy should be towards India as it relates to untouchability. In this resolution, what we tried to do was be fairly general and not attack the Indian government so much as just say, look, we acknowledge what Manmohan Singh had stated about untouchability being a problem and the efforts that were made in the Indian government to address it. But we also recognize that this is a serious institutional problem that needs to be addressed in a lot more ways than how it's being addressed already. And one of our primary goals was to make sure that U.S. government funding that is going into India would be protected, or like if there was any funding that was going into India from the U.S. government, that if it was in any way perpetuating the discrimination of Dalits or tribals, that would end. And so we were really trying to target the funding, U.S. government funding there, and also U.S. Verbal policy with India, so that the Indian government really knew that we took this seriously as a human rights issue, as a modern day slavery issue, that, you know, 250 to 300 million, I believe it is, Dalits and tribals in India, that's a number that's larger than, you know, all of the impoverished people of Africa combined. And it's simply unacceptable that in one country we allow that many people to live as dehumanized human beings. So we were targeting the funding of U.S. government programs that were happening in India, and then also the language that the U.S. government uses with Indian government to encourage a change. And so the resolution passed in the U.S. in the House. It went to the Senate and it didn't pass. And the reason it didn't is that it got held up by Senator Biden, but now Vice President Biden, in the Foreign Relations Committee on the Senate side. And from what we learned from the backroom, deals and everything, we tried to get it pushed through because it was bipartisan in the House. Tom Lantos helped us get it through the Foreign Relations Committee in the House. But once it got to the Senate side, it's just there's a lot more money that gets into the senators' hands from groups that don't want to see those kinds of things passed. And so basically it was not in his interest, from what we understood, to pass it and to even bring it up in the committee. So it just didn't go anywhere. And we pushed. We had other people pushing because the resolution was co-sponsored by Representative Ann Kilpatrick. I think it's Ann Kilpatrick. I forget her first name, but Representative Kilpatrick, and she was at the time the head of the Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, and so the Black Caucus had taken up a very strong interest in addressing this as a modern-day slavery issue, and so we had the support on the House side from the Black Caucus and from a number of other members on both the Republican and Democratic side, but just once it got to the Senate, it just didn't go anywhere, and so we tried for about a year and a half to get it through, and it just didn't go anywhere. One of the things that Babu had asked that I speak a little bit about are the advocacy groups in the U.S. and how they work with us to actually get things changed. So I'm just going to talk briefly about that. With regard to the resolution, the Dalit Freedom Network, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's affiliated with the All India Christian Council in India, and they are very, very good advocates on the issue of Dalits in the United States. They're very active, and they have a very strong bipartisan network. They are probably one of the most successful and active groups that I've seen, and I work with all religious communities and all different human rights groups on the Hill in Congress, and the Dalit Freedom Network is very effective in what they do. And they go door knocking to members of Congress, and they knock on their doors until they get somebody in front of them, and they talk to them about their issues, and they make them understand the issue and believe in the issue and support the issue from whatever particular interest area that member of Congress is interested in. So whether it's women's issues, or if they're African American from the side of slavery, or if they're Christian from the side of religious persecution, I mean they address it in any shape, way, or fashion to get those members of Congress interested in their issue, and they target all of the new members of Congress, which is really instrumental because every Congress we have about 20 to 40 or more new members, and especially this time we had a ton because all the Republicans got kicked out. So they target all of the new members, and they just get them on board to understand the issue. They also host trips to India, and so they take congressional delegations and other groups too to India and show them firsthand what is happening. So I didn't travel with them to India, but I did travel in September, and I worked with some of their affiliates when I was in India. And so I traveled to Karnataka and Orissa and UP and a lot of the other states, and I got to see what was happening on the ground, and that was just very useful for me. But that's just one of their other advocacy tools, and it's a very useful tool to get members of Congress or their staff on the ground to see these issues. Because then I never could have imagined what untouchability is like, even after having written the resolution, until I had been there. It's just something, I don't think anybody really understands the massiveness of India until they're there though, right? It's amazing. And so that's just another advocacy tool that's very useful. They also get a lot of public support and media support. One of the people on their board works with the movie industry, and so they're able to get famous people involved in the fight, and just to bring press around it. So there's just a lot of different tools that they used, but they were very helpful in getting certain members of Congress on board. And then in addition, my boss, Congressman Trent Franks, and myself worked with the Committee on Foreign Relations and other committees in order to get more members on board that way. And you needed a certain amount of members. You need like 30 members before you could get a resolution out of the committee. And so we were able to get that even more, I think we got like 39 or 40 something. And then it was introduced on the floor, and as soon as it went to the floor, it was a no-brainer. People weren't going to vote against this for the most part. If they had a problem, they abstained from voting. But for the most part, everybody, it was voted on unanimously. It was voted by unanimous consent. There wasn't a roll call vote saying who voted yes, who voted no. So it was great. Once we got to the floor, it was smooth sailing. But then it got stuck in the Senate. But that's just the Dalit Freedom Network. There are other groups in the United States, or actually there's a group here in the UK, the Christian Solidarity Worldwide UK, and they do a lot of work in the US as well. And they have a researcher that focuses specifically on India, and it's a Christian organization, but they work on the issue of Dalits and tribals and any issue related to human rights and religious persecution. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that affects people of all faiths in India. So. They are very effective. One of the things that they've been doing is they've been documenting the problems of Dalits in India specifically for the last couple of years, and they're going to be putting together a photo exhibit, and it'll be traveling around the world as far as I know, but it'll be in the US sometime hopefully this year. And so I was with them and their photographer in September in India, and it was amazing to me how they captured the dignity of dung collectors and the rat catchers and some of the other, really horrible jobs that Dalits are forced to do in India. Can we maybe hold them to the end?
Yeah, you're speaking very fast. Could you just repeat the names of those groups?
Oh, yes. The Dalit Freedom Network and Christian Solidarity Worldwide, UK.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the photo exhibit will be in the US, and that's just one way of advocating, because people in the United States, and I think a lot of places, and I was the same way until I actually started working on this for the congressman, we just have no idea how vast this problem is of untouchability. 250 to 300 million people are a lot of human beings that are undignified in the way that they're treated in a particular country. And it's a massive number. It's mind-boggling, and it's really hard to, in this modern day, to think that people are forced to collect dung, or that they're forced into temple prostitution because that's what they were brought up in life. And I met these people, so I experienced it firsthand. It's just unfathomable to think how human beings can treat other human beings in such a way, and that a society like it is in India largely accepts that that's the norm, that there are certain people that are born into that station in life and that's acceptable and they should be treated as such. And for me, that's just not acceptable, and I think for most of you here, you probably agree that people should not be, they're not born into a specific station in life, that every human being has dignity because of their humanity alone and should be treated with such. So I think that the photo exhibit that CSW is putting together is going to be very useful to simply help people capture what is really happening in India. Now, as you know, the US government has a very strong relationship with India and the Indian government. So this has been a difficult kind of issue for us to tackle. And we definitely wanted to do it gently. It's not that we want to attack India or Hinduism for this, but we do want to address the institutions that are enabling this or perpetuating this system to exist. And whether you're a friend or foe, that's something that the international community at large should address. Some of the other, I'm going to talk about some of the other things that we're doing in a minute, but let me go back to the trip to India that I took in September and talk a little bit about that. One of the things that I do for the congressman is I work specifically on human rights and religious freedom issues. And Babu had asked me to address that a little bit. And I'm going to limit my comments to the Dalits and tribals in India, and I visited the communities in Bangladesh and in Nigeria as well, but I'm just not as familiar with those issues, and most of my work has been on the Dalits, so I hope that's okay. But if you have questions about the others, feel free to ask me at the end. When I traveled to India, I was going there to specifically look at the attacks that had occurred in Orissa December a year and a half ago now, and then in August of last year. Originally, when I planned my trip, it was not knowing that the attacks in August were going to happen again. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but in August 2008, there were the Swami was murdered, and it was blamed on the Christian community, and then there were a number of attacks on that community. And what ensued afterwards was a very large, I think, Hindu nationalist rioting against the Christian community that were, many of them, I think at least 90 were murdered pretty brutally, and over 25,000 were displaced from their villages. And these were Dalits and tribals. So that was why I went there. When I went there, I met with the U.S. Embassy to talk to them about their perception of the event. And one of the big questions that have been coming out in the news reports we've been getting is that this was a Dalit on tribal conflict. That this was not a religious conflict, it was a Dalit on tribal conflict. And the U.S. Embassy kind of had that perception as well. They were a little bit more nuanced than that, but their perception was that it was a Dalit on tribal, it was a land issue, it was an economic problem. But when I traveled into Orissa, and I unfortunately didn't get to go into Kandahar, but when I went into just the capital there, what I found, meeting with people, I would meet with a room of internally displaced persons in the relief camps, and we'd have them raise their hand if they were from, the tribal community, and then we'd have them raise their hand if they were from the Dalit community, just to get percentages. And it was very, it wasn't very accurate, but in general, we had about 10% of the people from the tribal community and about 90% from the Dalit community. All of them were unequivocally Christian. A couple of people that were attacked in those events were Hindu, but they were attacked because they were working with Christians and perceived to be Christians, not because they were perceived to be Hindu. So the attacks were clearly religious in nature and clearly attacking tribals and Dalits. And what we uncovered as we talked to some secular Hindu groups there, human rights activists, and others throughout the time that we spent there, was that and this has been really well documented, and Jana Chatterjee, who's a great professor out in the US, she's written a whole book on this that we actually had her at Congress about 3 weeks ago, and she presented her book to Congress, and so that was great. But she wrote a whole book on I think it was called Violent Gods of War or something in India, I forget, but it was all about this conflict in Orissa. And so this has been really well documented by experts far greater than me. But what it came down to is that over the last 30 years in India, and in particularly in a lot of this happened in Karnataka and in Orissa, and it happened in other states as well, you had Hindu nationalist groups rise up, and the spread of the RSS and the BHP throughout India is really well reported. I met with the head spokesperson for the BHP, and he was telling me, basically, he told me that if you're born in India, you're born Hindu, and there's no way for you to convert because you're Hindu. And I was shocked, and I said, well, what about the indigenous tribes, the Dalits and the tribals? A lot of them are not Christian, they're not Muslim, they're not Hindu, they have indigenous beliefs. He said, no, they're Hindu because everything in India encompasses Hinduism. And this was, on the record, VHP head spokesperson. I was really shocked, and this was all very new to me. But, and I don't think that people really understand what's happening in India from that perspective. And that is that the violence that you have against a lot of the Muslims and the Christians and the Sikhs and the other communities there, and the secular Dalits and tribals, is very religious in nature. And it's using Hindu nationalism to suppress the religious or non-religious beliefs of all the people. And so when it comes to the Dalits and the tribals, over the last 30 years, I was mentioning something that happened. Swami Saraswati, I believe is his name, had been working on cow slaughter legislation and land issues and a number of other things and freedom of religion acts in Orissa to exacerbate these tensions amongst the Dalits and tribals and the rest of the state, and had been forcibly converting these indigenous peoples into Hinduism, and had been just inflaming sensitivities and other problems there amongst the different communities. That's what we saw, I think, last year, was just the eruption of all of that, and then the murder, and it was likely by malice, and that's just exacerbating it further. But clearly when you're looking at the issue of Dalits and tribals in India, there's a very religious dynamic to what's happening there. I think that Babu's explanation of some of the Hindu beliefs, clearly those are not the beliefs of all Hindus, but they are the beliefs of a strong percentage of the Hindu nationalist groups that are very active and strong in India, and that are working on legislation like these Freedom of Religion Acts and other things like that justify attacks against Dalits, tribals, untouchables, or even Muslims in Gujarat and other places. And there's complete impunity in this, so that it's a very entrenched system. I guess then moving away from that and going back to what the US government is doing, one of the problems I traveled there was to understand ERISA, but also to look at the issue of the Dalits and the tribals, and to look at how we could actually implement the legislation that we passed a couple years ago. Because it's great to pass a piece of legislation, but if you can't implement it, what good is it? And I know that it has the weight of force just by being passed, as far as making some people upset or making them realize that people are watching, but we want to go further than that. So we're working on a few different things. One of the things that we're working on, and Angana Chatterjee, if you guys haven't looked into her, she's great, and she put together a list of recommendations for us to start working on and different things that we're going to be doing. But one of those things that she did is that she had researched funding coming from the United States supporting Hindu nationalist groups in India, and these are groups that are suppressing Dalits and tribals and others. And one of the things that we're going to begin looking at is locating the funding and monitoring where the funding is going to, and if that funding is going to groups that are actively promoting discrimination against people, or persecution of people for religious beliefs, or forcibly converting them, or doing any of those things, then we are going to then prosecute those people in the United States for transferring those funds. So that's one of the things that we're going to begin looking at. The other thing is, I met with the U.S. Agency for International Development in Delhi, and they're pretty much a joke, but they said, well, we fund, I said, what are you specifically doing to promote the advancements of and greater equality for the Dalits and the tribal communities in India? And they said, well, almost everybody lives on less than $1 a day. There's so many poor people here, we help them all equally. And I said, well, that's not acceptable, because you have legislation, you're required to now do this. And so we've had problems with the U.S. Embassy and office in Delhi before, so I'm not surprised by the reaction. But I like on trafficking issues, they're ridiculous on trafficking issues, and you would think they're supposed to be monitoring these things, and yet their position is that it's a right to work issue, not that actually the people being forced into prostitution are Dalits, tribals, or people from other countries that are underage and don't even choose it, So, it's really sickening when you work in the government, you begin to see these things. But my role is to then just simply get on their case and to push them and push them and push them until they begin to change their policies. So those are a couple of the things. I'm trying to think what else. One of the other things that we're going to be doing is there's an appropriation bill in the United States Congress for foreign relations, and so that includes USAID and all the other agencies that we support in India or elsewhere. And I'm working with the Democratic office to put language into the appropriations bill that would prevent discrimination in any of the funding from being used. So it's not just in a piece of legislation that we sent out 2 years ago, but it's also in appropriation. So no funding, all the funding will be specifically limited, and it's like not an earmark, but it's a funding, I forget what you call it, but basically it's to prevent the funding from going through to any group in India that would discriminate. And then the two more things. One is just this week, or well, last week I wrote an amendment to the Foreign Relations Authorization Bill, which is the bill that funds the State Department, or that authorizes the State Department and all the programs for the State Department. And in that we wrote, I wrote an amendment that should be offered this week by my boss to ensure that the Secretary of State, so Secretary Clinton, would create a comprehensive study, and nobody knows this yet, so I guess just keep it private until it, maybe at the end of the week. I think it should be public, but if he offers it, I'm hoping he will. But it will require the Secretary of State to create a comprehensive policy on religious discrimination in India, but specifically to look into the funding issue and to look into these anti-conversion or Freedom of Religion Act laws that are basically biased against the freedom of religion for people of belief or no belief. And it calls on them to do a couple of other things, but it calls on them to end impunity against the communities that were attacked, and it addresses things in Gujarat, the Sikhs and the Christians that have been attacked in the recent years in India, and with impunity. Then the final thing, I guess, that I will mention is that we are going to reintroduce our resolution that we did, HCON Res 139, and so we'll be beginning to work on that. And if you get a chance to look at the last resolution and have any ideas or comments, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to take any suggestions that you might have. The one that my boss originally wrote, or that his staff originally wrote back in, I guess, 06 or 05 or 06, was too broad. It got stuck in the committee, so we had to really shorten it and kind of make it more concise. That it would only go to one committee, because as soon as it goes to more than one committee, it's not going anywhere. So we did that, which limited it in scope, but it was just the easiest way to get it through. I guess one more thing is we have other legislation in the United States in place to address government officials that attack people on the basis of religion. But if this happened for any other reason, usually the religion is associated with other things, so it might not even be associated with dollar or tribal issues. We would be able to prevent them from obtaining a visa into the U.S. as well. And so we did that for Modi. And one of the fears last summer was that Modi was trying to obtain a visa to come back into the U.S. And so we did some work to try to prevent that, even though it was kind of preemptory. But under the new administration, I think that he probably wouldn't be welcome in the U.S., or there wouldn't be as strong of a reaction against him. And so that's one of the things that we're going to continue to keep an eye on, because he should be held responsible for what he did in Gujarat, and he really hasn't been. I mean, it's like the second really in power under the BJP, or I don't know if that's exactly accurate, but it's pretty high up there. And so I guess that's, I'm going to stop there because I want to take questions.
Can I make some comments?
Yes.
I was very pleased with I just met her here, and things she has worked. Also, I'm quite aware of all the developments, and they are very important. In the meantime, when her resolution came through Congress to Senate for passing it, it is sitting with a gentleman who has been 10 years as a chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Biden, and he has become a vice president now. I did talk to him when he came in our area, and what it looks like is a more or less delayed because of the political reasons, as she was mentioning it. But in the meantime, I looked at the resolution. It was well drafted, but it has some shortcomings, which I sent to my congressman to modify, just a slight modification. I did mention to her just now, and we'll be working together. I'm extremely pleased that she has a first-hand experience on India, which is very rare, that somebody will come, experience it, and then go back and look into all these matters, so they understand much more in a very compassionate way. And this resolution, I sent it to my congressman as well as my senator. I briefed him at length, and they said they will support it. So when we go back, we can follow up that. In the meantime, the power of these extremist what Obama calls it, is growing in the United States to such an extent, it will be very difficult to stop them even. All the cabinet of the Obama is surrounded by the Hindus who made a lot of money and who donated a lot of money. I'm quite aware of them. I'm watching every one of them last 20 years. And they will block it. This I experienced in the past also whenever I tried to contact the United States ambassador in many of the United Nations committees in which I was involved. And there is always a doorkeeper of a Hindu background, and they don't feel comfortable when I tell them what the subject is. So this, what she mentioned, is that's correct. We'll have to work a little bit more diplomatically. Third thing is that last year, probably in January, or probably the year before last, there was a resolution before the California Committee on Education, California Board of Education. And there, every 2 to 3 years, they re-evaluate the content of grade 6, grade 7 history book. She is quite aware of that. And there, it was very flatly written, very well written, that there is a caste system in the Hindu religion, and some people are treated as untouchables, etc. So some Hindus complained to the US government that they have been bored, that no, this has to be changed. It doesn't look very good for Hindu religion, so we should make it more milder or something. And our Sikh group, Punjabi brothers who are there in that area, I talked to them, and we wrote a lot of drafts on that matter. We talked to some of the committee members also on board, and finally the board decided that this is a fact. I said, don't change a single word, everything is perfect there. So they finally kept it intact. In the meantime, our Hindu friends collected $1.8 million to fight the case, and some frivolous ground, they started a case there, and some cases going on right now. That's my latest information. And as far as the money is concerned, she was mentioning that tons of money comes from there and goes to the fundamentalist organization through VSP and through religious organization under the Religious Freedom Act. The problem is to stop them is a little bit difficult, because these people who want to send the money, they will always create another organization, send it through it, but there is a sort of a format has to be done so that the regulations will be blocking them to some degree. And last time, when the VSP got a lot of money, it was stopped by a complaint to the IRS. She was talking about it. This money is tremendous amount of money when it comes to India, and with that money, these people use their muscle power to crush everybody. So I think that we'll have to work also in US on that matter, though both the things are very important as far as the future role of action is concerned. And I think I congratulate her. Being even from Republican side, we had no idea that some of the Republicans are interested in this. So I learned from that. My congressman is a Democrat. My senator is also a Democrat, so I'll be more than glad to work with her. And I think it's a very important news as far as moving in different directions is concerned. The same thing has to be done also in the European market, where you folks will be very handy for that. Thank you.
I guess just one more thing I'll mention is that last December, I guess it was, we had a hearing on the problem in ERISA and what was happening. And the Religious Freedom Caucus is co-chaired by a Democrat, so it's completely bipartisan. And my Democratic co-chair had gotten a phone call from the Foreign Affairs Committee to tell them that they shouldn't have the briefing, that they should cancel it. And so they called me and they said, well, why are they trying to get us to cancel it? And anyway, the reason they were trying to get us to cancel is they had had a lot of people call into the Foreign Relations Committee. I'm guessing, upper caste Hindus that didn't like us in ERISA, that complained and didn't want the hearing to happen. And instead, the Foreign Affairs Committee wanted to do a resolution on women's rights, which was a tragedy. And I understand why they wanted to deal with that, but I don't understand why they wanted to deal with that and not deal with a problem that had been ongoing for almost a year at that point. So then after the actually during the hearing, because we went ahead with it, and Ghana Chatterjee was there with us, and she was amazed that these groups were calling in too, and that the Democrats on the Foreign Affairs Committee wanted us to stop it. But my Democratic co-chair for the Religious Freedom Caucus said, no way, we're going to continue with the hearing. So we were fine. But once we got in there, I got an email from some professor at MIT in the US, and then a couple of other people, like a Sikh and a Muslim and a few other people, saying, we've heard on our college campuses that the VHP were working to try to stir up trouble against your hearing and get people to call in. Just know that we're very glad that you're actually going through with it. I just thought, it's just amazing, but that's the kind of pressure that I have seen. I haven't seen all the rest, but I know that after introduced the resolution, and then my boss spoke on the floor about it, and then when it passed, we've gotten so much hate mail from it, but we don't really care. I mean, it doesn't affect us, you know, we'll still do it. But, and then the colleague that was working in my boss's office before me that worked on the first draft of the Dalit resolution, she actually worked on the California case. She worked to fight, you know, with the groups, the Hindu groups they were doing. One of the groups that I had mentioned that has been really problematic, I think, on this issue in the United States is the Hindu American Foundation.
Right.
So I don't know if you're familiar with them, but I think it's, yeah.
Sorry. Mr. Varade probably did mention the name that really kind of jolted us. People who are Indians in the US and also here is Sonal Shah.
Yeah.
And Sonal Shah, the kind of work that you've been talking about going to Odisha, if you had gone to Gujarat and checked what she was doing, she was supporting Ekal Vidyalayas, which is an RSS outfit. It's a kind of a tribal outreach program they have to Hinduize Adivasis, and this indirectly, directly I would say, funded the hate campaigns in the Dang's districts of Gujarat in 98-99, just when the BJP had come to power. And there was persecution, similar to the Lakhananda Saraswati character in Odisha. They had a couple of swamis in Gujarat who are patronized by industrialists like Ambani's and who have direct support from the BJP. And the money that Sonal Shah and her VHP parents were raising, and Sonal Shah was trying to say when there was this campaign mounted against her saying, Obama, don't take Sonal on board.
Yeah.
And she is going to block. She's there basically to ensure that probably Modi gets in this time, and also to ensure that this kind of legislation probably doesn't really, I mean, this kind of a resolution doesn't get too far.
Yeah.
And as long as, Sonal Shah, I don't know how one can shame Sonal Shah into accepting these things, because she has herself said she was once voted, I think, in 2001 or sometime around then, person of Indian origin of the year kind of, you know, in the US. And she was very proud of her very Hindu work and Hindutva work back home, and her parents have hosted top BJP and RSS leaders at their house. And you can say, of course, you don't need to judge the daughter by what the parents do, but the daughter herself was very proactive in these issues. So it's a grim scenario where you're talking about a democratic government doing this. So
We have been following that, and I think there's just more criticism we need to make of her being still in the government right now. But I think, you know, if you have any more information from, you know, from your work that we might not have, that you can share with us, that would be helpful.
I would definitely have the entire PDFs of from Sonal Shah's brother's website.
Okay.
I've saved them so that in case they later go and delete them from their website and say we didn't do this. And there's it says who can apply for those things, and even there is discrimination. So there's down the line she has been associated with these groups and she has never denied it.
I'll just 1 second comment. About Sonal Shah, when she was asked to join Obama's interior organization before he took over, and just around that time, her name was recommended. Some people raised the objection that she is connected to RSS, and there were a lot of objections, but she denied it. I have anything to do with the RSS at all. I am totally a simple worker and all those things, and she got away with that. Not only that, but around her are the whole community about whom she was talking about, this Hindu foundation. That foundation also is in it now lately. I have been observing all this last 20 years. So she also is gotten in the cases. The whole circle around him is pro RSS, pro Hindu. So I think we'll have to just fight back on the different level through back doors. And I'll be delighted to work. Yeah.
And can I just mention there, I work with another organization in the United States that actually has done, that's done legal work for other religious communities, and there are Hindu groups in the United States that are, you know, totally against what these Hindu nationalist groups are doing. So I just want to be clear that it's not all of them. It's easy to generalize in this context, but I just don't want to, you know, I don't want to overstate it, that there are groups that are not doing these things as well, and they're actually fighting against it. So.